Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Anas and I will be hosting today's session with an exciting lineup of guest speakers. FEMYSOnow, this webinar, is a live stream and podcast series by FEMYSO, which we started this Ramadan, and it will air every Sunday and Wednesday until the 13th of May, inshallah. We will be live on both YouTube and Facebook. And today's topic: anxiety and depression are the most common illnesses in Western countries, affecting nearly 50% of us during our lifetime. Many more are struggling with stress-related symptoms and reduced mood. And these phenomena strongly reduce the quality of life of the individual and affect the public health of a society. Today, together with our esteemed guests during the holy month of Ramadan, we shall explore how we can maintain our mental health as well as discuss the stigma that surrounds the matter. And with us, we have Dr. Rania Awaad from the USA, from the West Coast. She's a clinical associate professor at Stanford University School of Medicine and director of the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab. She's also professor of Islamic law at Zaytuna College. Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Rania.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my honor to be here with you all.
Thank you. And with us also we have Iman bin Ahmed from the United Kingdom. She's a counselor and a psychotherapist. She's a project manager at the Grenfell WellCommunity, which provides a range of free independent help and support for those affected by the Grenfell fire. And we will inshallah jump into this webinar by asking the first question to Dr. Rania. What inspired you to go into the field of mental health?
MashaAllah, it's a loaded question, MashaAllah, so I will give a short synopsis. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. The short answer to it is I first studied the Islamic sciences and was heavily active in my community teaching, but was before the original Zaytuna Institute that became the college then later. And in the meantime, I found that as much as I was answering questions for people and teaching the Islamic sciences, many people would ask very personal questions that no matter how much fiqh I learned or answers I could give, they were beyond that. They were much more personal in nature. And I realized I was not equipped to counsel. And I think at that time I was already in pursuing my medical studies, although planning on going into women's health, something completely different, subhanAllah. And it became clear to me that it would be probably better to pursue the route of psychiatry, specifically to be able to address some of the mental health concerns we were seeing. So in a very roundabout way, I ended up in the field. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the best of planners. But bringing the Deen background in with the psychiatric studies has been very helpful, at least for me personally. And I'm hoping for those others who have been seeking out kind of an Islamically based counseling system.
MashaAllah. And while we're in the field of Islamic teachings, as Muslims, what teachings can we draw upon when we think about our own mental health?
That's a wonderful question. And I think there's a lot from our own tradition that we can really pull from. And often we look to other traditions or we look to other places to try to fill that gap that we sometimes think we have. But the reality is within our own Islamic tradition, we actually have quite a bit. In fact, I would say even more superior actual concepts that we can pull from. You might know that a lot of the work that I've done is related to pulling out some of the historical understandings of mental health and mental illness from our Islamic tradition. And in that, I think, alhamdulillah, we've discovered a treasure trove over at the Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab of scholars of our Islamic tradition that have written quite a bit on these topics and have taken from the Islamic tradition. So I'll share with you just briefly one that I love to write about and talk about, mashallah, which is Balkhi. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi from the 9th century. And he has some really wonderful concepts that even the modern day psychologist or counselor could really find, realize that they're already using these same concepts. But the beautiful thing about him is he's integrating Islam into the religious spiritual understanding into the counseling. So briefly, he says, for example, that just like you might have things that bother you physically, externally, you might, if you're very cold or very hot, you might put on a jacket or take off a jacket, for example. Then he gives the example how internally, if you have negative thinking and thoughts that are bothering you, or even if they're external, as in to say other people who are kind of, or maybe it's the news that's giving you quite a bit of anxiety related to what you're listening to, or just company that's always very negative, then he says, just like the jacket that you put on or off when you're hot or cold, you must do the same with your kind of anxious or harmful thoughts that are coming to you. And part of that self-convincing monologue that he refers to in his book, he then ties to some of the Quranic verses and reminds us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that this hayat dunya, this life on earth, is meant to be a place of tests and trials, and that He's already made that we do not assume that we're in a place that's meant to be other than a place of tests and trials, because then we're setting ourselves up for failure and really making ourselves looking for the type of life that's not really realistic on this earth. And he quotes, verses from the Quran, and Surah Al-Baqarah, of course, has the very verse that talks about how Allah tests us with our, fear and hunger and loss of wealth and lives. And certainly in this COVID era, we are experiencing all of the above, subhanAllah. Mm-hmm. So, in conclusion, he really draws us back to being both realistic, drawing from the spiritual aphorisms that you really hold on to, that Allah will not test you more than, or burden you more than you can bear. And that it's very, very useful to try to bring those concepts together.
Barakallahu feek, Dr. Rania, for this concise idea of what Islamic teachings we can draw upon when we think about our own mental health. I will let in Iman bin Ahmed. You have a lot of on-the-ground experience, mashallah. And when it comes to mental health, in your opinion, what is the source of the stigma that we can see in Muslim communities and other communities when it comes to talking about mental health, or raising the issue of mental health?
There's quite a few reasons, I think. It's hard to pinpoint maybe what the reason for stigma is, but having kind of reflected a little bit on my work and why specifically in Muslim communities or minority communities, and generally as well, people don't like to stand out in a negative way. And with a lot of stereotypes that have been perpetuated amongst the years about kind of what someone with mental health issues looks like and what their experience like, and the fact that they can't function in society. I think whether that's the media, whether it's kind of stories about distant relatives or friends, or that person that can't function, and it becomes very isolating, I think, to think of yourself as that person or someone within your family as that person. So I think it's important to understand it from that perspective, because sometimes we otherwise people that have stigma as well, like it becomes a cycle, because they're just like, oh, those people, they don't understand, right? And it becomes like, it's hard to connect. But actually, when we think about it in that way, obviously no one wants to stand out in a negative way, and people actually want to be supported, but they might not have either the means, the language for it, and when I say language, what I mean is that it's not that they can't express that they have hardship, but it could be like, for example, thinking of the UK, to go to your doctor and say, actually, I'm struggling with this thing. Why would you think that your doctor would understand that? Because you usually go to your doctor with physical ailments. So it becomes, I think there's a lot that is lost in communicating that you're struggling. And that's what it comes down to, isn't it? Mental health, we're struggling on a deep level. And if you put it in those words, well, most people can relate with struggling. Most people can relate with hardship. I think everybody can. So just to give an example, recently in one of my projects, because after COVID-19 happened, and we're trying to connect with people via phone, and trying to get help out there. So we have one of our GPs or doctors that we're connecting with, who's referring patients to us who might be struggling, right? So it's not guaranteed that they are, but they said, here's a list of children and families that might appreciate some support. I call up one family about about their daughter, and I said, oh, would you like some support during this time with mental health, mental well-being? And the father was really offended by my question. He said, how dare you, how dare you call me and say there's something wrong with my daughter? I said, no, I didn't say there's anything wrong. And it was all in the language. I tried my best to say, oh, we're providing this, mental well-being support. And that support could be either drawing with, children on the phone, doing activities. It's a range of different things. But the reason he was offended, because it was very personal, because he took it as, this is a judgment on my parenting. Maybe my child is not feeling okay because I didn't do well. And in collectivistic society as well, there's the family unit is very much seen as something that you are proud of, right? So when you go out in society, you think, okay, I did a good job as a parent. So there's multiple reasons. We can go into them. I think there's a question hopefully coming up about how do we start the conversation. So that's just a bit, just an idea about the different reasons that could, perpetuate stigma.
There's a multifaceted way of looking.
Absolutely.
You're active in a civil society organization. Do you have any tips for Muslim organizations when it comes to countering stigma?
Well, I think you guys are a perfect example of that. Starting the conversation, on a broad level. Anyone that is interested can join, but also, people who are curious might tune in and see what is this about. So making it as available as possible. Also, I think if anyone has a bit of whether it's knowledge or expertise, or even just like a kind, heart that can just provide support to someone, I think sometimes removing the label can be beneficial. So a lot of people are scared of the word, or the phrase mental health, or depression, anxiety. I'm not saying all of that doesn't exist and we should scrap it, but it doesn't always have to be packaged in a way where it might be a bit clinical. So we started the conversation around struggle. How can we support each other? How can we uplift each other? I think, and again, on a society level, student societies, I remember I was delivering a workshop a couple of years ago on how to provide peer support. And quite a few people showed up to help others. So if you have the skills to support, attend. If you have a friend or a family member, I don't ask why are you there. Most people are there for personal reasons, and that's okay. And so starting either these conversations or even support groups, no matter how small, because some people might think, oh, we need to start an organization to be able to help people. No, actually, if you're 3 friends or 3 people that are interested in mental health, if each one of you allocates an hour to support someone on the phone or on campus, that goes a long way, because that's 3 more people that you supported than none. So I'm happy to share some resources afterwards in terms of how to, start the conversation as well. But this is definitely a start.
Basically, many a little makes a mickle, as the saying goes.
Exactly.
Dr. Rania, when it comes to from your research, where does the source of stigma come from, and on whom does the responsibility fall on to counter this stigma about talking about mental health?
Sure. I think Iman did a lovely job explaining, the source of stigma, how we, each or every one of us carries a stigma. Even if we don't think we have biases, we all have implicit bias. We all do. We carry a certain amount with us, and there's always that sense of, I don't want it to be me. SubhanAllah. In terms of who can counter, the answer in short is really everybody needs to counter this. And if you want to look at the research to see, when we ask Muslims, and this is questions that are asked to everybody, but we actually did a survey study, the largest actually on the American Muslim population and regarding to perceptions on mental health. So that was a very interesting study. It was on Muslim women specifically, but and about 1,300 women filled that survey. And so in that study, we found actually what's replicated in other studies as well. When we ask, who are you most likely to seek out help go to if you thought you had a mental concern, first, second, and third, the first is always family, always. They are the first line always, interestingly enough. And then it might be the friends. And then third, interestingly, are the imams or the community leaders, the spiritual religious figures in the community. They are publicly, they are the first line of defense always. People go to them for every need, it seems, even if they may not necessarily themselves be versed in that. Whether it's marriage, kids, drugs, divorce, whatever it may be, they go to our imams. And at the very end of that list were the actual professionals, the mental health professionals. So when you look at that list, it means then it's not really just on the hands of the doctors or professionals or counselors. It actually starts all the way back at family and friends and our religious leaders. And if all of those three groups, just those alone, were versed in this lingo of mental health and normalizing it and making it understood that all of us feel various spectrum of emotions throughout our life, some of which need addressing and some may not, then there's a likelihood of actually getting that support and care for those who do need it. And we find that partnership with the work that we do here stateside with the Muslim counseling, the Khalil Center, we find that our imams are our best friends. Honestly, those who are psychologically minded and understand this concept have been wonderful, because as soon as someone comes to them and asks for all the many things that they are not necessarily trained in, they immediately say, that sounds like a counseling request that you need to go to the professionals for. And it's been a lovely partnership, and I think that's very important.
Thank you for your insights. We live in very special times with this pandemic, with COVID-19, and in some societies, or in all of the societies, basically, we can see a heightened sense of anxiety. Are there any pro tips that you can share with this audience? Because maybe they're streaming from all of Europe, countries that have been affected differently. Some advice for how to overcome this anxiety.
Are you looking at me, Anas?
Don't know who you're looking at.
Okay,
sounds
good. I'm sure we both can answer here, inshallah. I'll share with you a couple practical tips that I've been sharing with others related to COVID that I feel, well, at least I hope they've been, useful. The first of which is I really feel that it's important that people do share how they're feeling. I think a lot of what we're seeing now in the web therapy that we're offering and the crisis lines that people are talking to us on, a lot of people, especially the caretakers of the family, those who are the breadwinners, those who are the parents who are juggling multiple roles with the homeschooling now at home and juggling work at home and many different things happening, or just simply concerned about the multiple generations they take care of, the elders, the young people. That they're not talking to anybody. They're bottling up all the emotions and trying to be strong for everybody else. But this is such an overwhelming situation. It's a pandemic. And talking to those whom you trust is really important. It doesn't necessarily have to go all the way to the point of professionals. I'll come to that later. But first, it should be those who are trusted to really share in that emotions. And the second part of that same number one is to really listen in. So we find with the children, or with the elders, or with those who are otherwise feeling very vulnerable because of COVID, that they're needing that sympathetic ear. And so that's been a very important point that we've been really emphasizing to many people. Second on the list is really to moderate the news intake. I think it's hard in this time. We're really stuck on our social media or our news feeds, trying to keep up and pace. How much longer are we sheltered in place here in California? They just announced to the end of every month they announce another month of sheltering in place. So people are very much, stuck on their news, but unfortunately it's overstimulating. It's very detrimental. And it's Ramadan too. So for Muslims, we're telling them, fast not just from your food and drink, but also from your social media and news consumption, because it brings up the anxiety. And third is taking the time out to really take care of oneself. whether that be in eating well, of course, after breaking fast, mashallah, or whether it be in sleeping well. For many in Ramadan, this is a difficult, the sleep-wake cycle changes, but trying to get some good sleep and good eating habits, still exercising even when fasting, and then spiritual connection. And there's never a better time than the month of Ramadan to really spiritually connect, because that all lowers the anxiety. And fourth, for many people, being action oriented is very important and lowers their anxiety. And so we're finding, whether that's by financial support, so helping those who are on the front line. We have people here in our community who are doing meal trains for the elders or those who are otherwise isolated, others who are sewing masks for those who need masks. Just putting your energy into helping others also lowers anxiety. And lastly, this is the point I was going to come back to, which is, if all of these things fail or they're not helping enough, then it probably means that it's an indication that it's time to talk to someone who is a professional counselor in the field. And alhamdulillah, maybe one of the silver linings of this COVID era is that all the counselors, it seems, are now on web therapy or phone therapy of some sort, so they're more accessible than ever before. So we really encourage that people do get help when they need to.
Iman bin Ahmed, you're a project manager at the Grenfell WellCommunity, which provides a range of free independent help and support to those affected by the Grenfell fire. You see that people that you meet may have different needs, different ways, different things that might help them battle anxiety. Could you give us some advice on the advice that you have provided to these people?
On top of Dr. Rania's advice, great advice. I think she's kind of gone through most of it. But I think, kind of drawing on the specific environment that I'm in, obviously it's all changed right now. A lot of the connection that we had was face-to-face, group-based, getting people back into the community, especially a traumatized community. And that doesn't mean people that were living in the tower or necessarily right around it. It's just, as a community as a whole, you feel like, there was a sense of loss. So we try to help with that loss by creating spaces, safe spaces, and where we kind of would cook and have conversations and, have connections where people, oftentimes when they're at home, they might feel isolated. So the whole point was to reduce isolation, and we're still trying to work on that. There's a lot that has changed because we can't do that anymore, unfortunately. But we realized that people are connecting on on a different level now, like Dr. Rania said, now the phone support, people that never really accessed that type of support as well, now considering it, even though they were, a lot of people I noticed were overwhelmed before, but because day-to-day life got to them and stuff, now that they are bound, to the house, they are trying to reach out more and become more resourceful in that sense. I think it's important to stay connected to loved ones, not just by talking to them, because a lot of people are talked out in this time. I know I sometimes get to the end of the day and I'm like, wow, I've been on the phone all day, in front of a screen all day, when before I used to break that up with, different, journeys, being on the bus or, so I think even if you're doing an activity together over the phone, if you're going out for a walk and you feel like you're isolated, maybe having, someone to plan that walk with and have, they can simultaneously go on a walk themselves. I found that worked for some people. They say, actually, that's a good idea, because you don't necessarily have to talk all the time, but, or having the video on while you're painting or you're cooking. So doing kind of day-to-day activities, but staying connected through that. Of course, acknowledging what you're going through. We recognize that everything is changing and it's changing day to day as well. So I think it's okay to feel like you're repeating yourself, because everyone, is a bit confused right now. We're all confused, even as counselors, and mental health experts, all of that. We're trying to figure it out, and how to stay sane ourselves. At least I'm seeing it for myself. Trying to understand what's going on. So that's okay, keeping that conversation going. But when we realize that anxiety has gotten a bit, out of hand, it is important to break that up, reduce the news, do something. And I say positive in the sense of like, not just like forget about everything, but more about engage yourself, because the mind now is kind of it's honing in on everything that's bad, because that's the environment that we're around, isn't it? It's out there, it's on the news, it's everywhere. So what can you do now? Stay connected to the now. And you know, on a spiritual level as well, it's kind of being grateful. Okay, I've got my health, I've got my, you know, my space and all that, reflecting, saying alhamdulillah, like, you know, this is what we've been given right now in this time. And also, I think this is something that I'm doing, making plans. And what I mean by that, even though that might sound a bit crazy, but especially my parents aren't with me at the moment, and I had plans to visit them before all this happened that got cancelled. So every time we speak to each other, we talk about the things that we want to do together. When we didn't do that as much, we just say, oh, you know, I'll just see you whenever I see you. But now we're like, okay, when we see each other, we're going to go out to the park, we're going to do this, we're going to go here. And that gives us a bit of hope for when we do see each other. And so it's okay to call up your friends and be like, okay, this is what we're going to do afterwards, because there will be, inshallah, you know, and after, you know, after all of this happens, there will be a release, inshallah.
I just want to make a call for the people watching this webinar, this live stream, that you can ask questions in the YouTube section, the comment section, or in the Facebook comment section. So you can ask questions, and our moderators will inshallah provide me with those to pose them to Iman, Ahmed, and Dr. Rania. Some youth have parents that may have long-standing issues when it comes to trauma due to violence or racism or displacement. How are there any tips, Dr. Rania, when it comes to how they can encourage their parents or people in their families to seek help for this?
Absolutely. This is probably one of the more challenging, honestly, one of the more challenging things to do. And we often say in this field of psychology and psychiatry is that you can only really, you know, bring somebody in for help once they themselves are motivated to get that help. So you can't help somebody who doesn't want to be helped, unfortunately. And that's so hard when it's your own family members, when it's your own parents, let's say, loved ones. The best thing that a youth can do is to help inspire that person to get that kind of help and support. So what that means, often it looks like one of two things. Either it looks like, you know, being able to help, again, we talked about stigma earlier, normalize these things, explain that there are, let's say you mentioned, for example, trauma or racism, the Islamophobia that so many of us are facing. If that tends to be what it is, kind of normalizing how many of us feel it, and many get help and support for it, for example. If that doesn't work, the direct kind of communication approach and trying to convince and discuss does not work, then the second thing that we often tell people, youth and others, is that they would get counseling for themselves. And people might say, well, why would I get counseling? I don't need it. It's so-and-so that needs it. And the answer to that is because then the counseling really helps you figure out how to deal with somebody who is otherwise traumatized or is otherwise showing difficult behaviors or so on, that you learn how to cope and deal and manage with that loved one, a family member who's not willing to change. And often that strengthens that individual person and helps them help the other person, or even inspire change in that other person.
When we talk about mental health in general, maybe to me and many others, it's something that goes on inside of this. But how does it affect the rest of our bodies when we have a lack of mental health or struggling with mental health, Dr. Rania?
That's a beautiful question, because as you probably know, we've developed a model at the Khalil Center that we draw on Islamic sources, because in modern, if you will, Eurocentric, sorry, you guys are in Europe, this concept of Eurocentric Western psychology, if you will, is very much like you mentioned here, brain oriented, mind oriented, and many people think that that's kind of where it goes. But the Islamic model, honestly, is one that's much more holistic and takes into account other aspects of the Muslim, of the individual. And what that means is it's not just the mind, which is the aql, but also the heart, the qalb, right? The nafs, the spirit, and the ruh, the spirit. And when you bring all these together, the emotions, ihsas, when you bring all these aspects together, then you have a much more complementary model where one affects the other. So it's actually, in the Islamic tradition, the heart is actually the seat of emotion, not so much the mind and brain. And so, but there's a feedback loop between them. And instead of going into a very, inshallah, theoretical model, because you can read about that, inshallah, in our new book on Islamic psychology, but that's coming out this summer, in fact. But but this concept of it does affect. So spiritually speaking, when somebody is troubled, let's say it's with depression or anxiety, the heart is also not at rest, right? And I don't just mean the physical heart, we're talking about the metaphysical heart, if you will. And it also means that emotionally, ihsas, that's the case, but also their ruh, their spirit is also troubled. So you can see very quickly how all these aspects of somebody needs support and counseling. So if you just do cognitive therapy, just logically try to speak to them, it doesn't always work, right? Because sometimes you need to speak to the very soul spiritually that's actually affecting the person who's troubled, and so on and so forth. So I hope that helps answer kind of in brief this very holistic Islamic concept that we have.
Inshallah. We can link to the book later in the comment section, inshallah. Sister Iman, when we discuss how to counter things that affect our mental health, sometimes we tend to hear the expression identify the source, identify the triggers. What does this really mean, and how can we become aware of our own struggles?
I think that that's something that stems, from my opinion, and kind of from psychodynamic therapy, where we kind of go way back from childhood. There are certain things that kind of growing up with certain structures and, being raised in a certain community and all of that, we develop ways of coping. But also there are certain things that affect us specifically. So what I mean by that is, you mentioned earlier discrimination and Islamophobia and racism. If we grow up in that community where we've experienced a lot of that, we might be sensitive to it a lot more than someone that might not have been exposed to it as much. So that could be a trigger for us. So when it's there, we feel really affected if it's not processed, right? We haven't really dealt with it. And also it's not just internally dealt with, it's externally on a societal and structural level as well. So what I mean by that, so I could be easily triggered if someone attacks me because I'm wearing the hijab, because I'm in a society where I feel like maybe I'm a target. And if we live life feeling like we're targets, that could be a very scary life. That could be a life filled with anxiety and fear. So identifying the source, seeing where that comes from, what is the thing that makes me uncomfortable? What are the things that I can do to deal with it, and to protect myself, but also to process it as well. So what does that mean when someone calls me that? What is it? How does that affect me? And like I said, on a structural level, there have to be changes. And until then, how do we function as individuals? So I'm not saying, okay, we can counter racism by just like feeling like, like it doesn't exist. It does. It definitely exists. So going back to the source means actually, okay, what is it that's within my ability? A lot of the time, a lot of things are outside of our ability, which is what causes anxiety. I feel like, well, actually, there's nothing I can do about this. And I feel, again, going back to the example of COVID-19, right? A lot is beyond our control. So what is it that is within my control? And understanding my triggers. So like I said, going on the bus or whatever, on the train, something like that happens, or what it could be a look sometimes, right? That can trigger. It could be that person is maybe I stepped on their foot. I don't know. But my trigger is that is my worldview. That's how I see that. Maybe I'm expecting it more. So it could be that I can sit there and reflect and see, okay, what is it that I feel like, what grounds me? Why is it that I wear the hijab, right? Understanding why is it that I continue to wear this, even though I feel like sometimes it might bring me some danger or some anxiety, and that can ground me. So understanding my trigger can help me find a solution to how I deal with it. And you can use that, I think, with a lot of different examples. I use that because maybe it's a bit more personal, or maybe related to the West of the question that you asked earlier. So going back, the source can also be family. You're in an environment where certain ideas are normal, and kind of you start thinking that you can take that outside of the house, and then, you know, you have to deal with it within your family. So maybe the family doesn't really talk about things, brush things under the carpet, right? So maybe, again, like Dr. Rania said, if you go to counseling yourself, try to identify maybe how is it that I deal with it, but also how can I start that conversation with my family members. Maybe family itself can be triggering, right? A lot of people, they're fine in professional settings, right? And then they go home and they get really triggered by their sibling or by their spouse or by their mom and dad, right? Because you feel like, actually, that person brings me back to what I remember that child within. I feel defenseless, or I feel like, you know, you always do this to me. And so I think there's a lot of unprocessed stuff. There's so much there. Sorry, I know I might be going on, but there's so much that could influence what could trigger us. And a lot of the time it does require a level of reflection, and also a strength that you can do yourself, but also get support from someone else, whether it's friend or family members. Talk through it, figure it out, actually, what is affecting me, and why is it affecting me to an extent where it affects my life. I think that's what's really important about triggers, and living your life with anxiety is if it doesn't affect my life that much, if I feel like actually I can keep living life and that's something I can brush aside, that's fine. But if it affects my life, where I feel like I'm becoming, you know, I'm avoiding leaving the house, or I'm avoiding that person, and I'm, you know, then actually we need to reflect and think, actually, what can I do to make it a little bit better? It could be some people go into activism, and that helps them because they feel like, actually, I'm doing something on a structural level. I'm making my voice heard about discrimination, anxiety. So everyone has their different way. Not everyone needs to go into activism, not in that way, maybe, but everyone's doing their part in society. So figure out what it is that sits comfortably with you. It's talking to someone, going into activism, writing a blog about it, writing a journal. There's so many different things, but I think there does require a level of self-reflection, I think.
Dr. Rania, from your work as a director for Stanford Muslim Mental Health Lab, can you see in Muslim communities specific reoccurring triggers, and how do you advise them when it comes to overcoming or handling them?
Sure, yes, of course. I mean, certainly in terms of what are the common triggers that people are having that bring them into counseling, that we see at the Khalil Center, and honestly also in just our research on Muslim mental health. So definitely high on the list, but not the only on the list, is the topic of racism or feeling othered. Certainly this is although where we are Muslim, as Muslims, we're minorities within the society, larger society around us. That's been definitely a case. I think for many people, they have dealt with either blatant Islamophobia or at least some form, even if mild. So that sense is there. But interestingly, the most common causes of coming into therapy are, I would say, human conditions. They're not unique to Muslims. There are cases, they're basically marital discord or parenting, or they are related to academic or job loss or some amount of life circumstances, right? These are things that are shared by all people, regardless of faith and background. So it's interesting to see that Muslims often have a very rosy picture and say, oh, no, we don't have problems with our marriages. We certainly do, and divorce rates in Western Muslim countries are we are Western Muslims, as in to say we have the same rates as, non-Muslim Westerners in our rates, unfortunately, as much as we don't want to admit this, but this is the case. And our youth struggle just like non-Muslim youth struggle, right? So I think the most important point to bring home here is that we all actually, in some form or another, even if it's not clinical diagnosed, right? Depression or anxiety or even more serious conditions, at some level, we all need counseling for the many things that trigger us. And I think that's the most important thing I think I've learned over time, and I certainly didn't know before my training.
Well, we've had some questions coming in from the audience. When it comes to, and this is a question for Dr. Rania, do you see a potential cultural shift in our Muslim communities to refer to specialists rather than only religious leaders? As we mentioned, they're the first in the line in the public sphere for mental health issues. And do you see this as being a good thing? The question was from Sundus.
Sure, thank you for your question. And yes, I do believe that there will be and can be a culture shift, and I'll tell you why. We've been hosting Imam trainings now with the Khalil Center for as long as we've been in existence, which is 10 years, alhamdulillah. And in the last several years, I would say for sure, and I have had my personal experience actually training a room full of imams. And when you are training, it's really interesting. I'll share a very quick just snapshot of why I think this could actually happen. We had an imam within our community, one of our long-time imams, somebody we love and we respect and we rely upon quite a bit. And as a result, he probably gets a lot of the cases, like we mentioned, of course, before these cases go anywhere else. And when he came to the training, which was a mandatory training, was an 8-hour full day imam training on how to figure out what is mental health in the first place and what is the role of the imam versus what is the role of the professional and how do you refer? And how does the professional also refer back to the imam for roles that are not theirs, right? Each has their duties. And this particular imam, he's given me permission to tell the story because it's quite short but funny. That the first hour of the training, he had his laptop open and he was working on whatever, not really focusing at all with what we were saying. Within the second hour of this 8-hour training, he kind of, you could see he was looking up beyond his laptop, kind of interested, listening to what was happening. And by the third hour, he had shut the laptop and was just really intensely listening. MashaAllah. And by the very last hour of the training, he opened his laptop up again. And I thought, oh, here we go, mashallah. And he was writing furiously on the laptop. And afterwards, he said, the reason I opened my laptop back up is because when I first came here, I thought, I've been an imam for over 30 years. I don't need this information. But as I started to listen, I realized how much I didn't actually know. And what I was doing here at the very last hour is I was writing a message to all of my imam friends that tomorrow they have to come and take this training. Mashallah. And sure enough, all of his friends showed up the next day. All these imams, mashallah, showed up for the training. And while it's a lovely story, it does actually show how important it is to have the buy-in from our religious leaders. And they're not only that they are fully understanding what this story about mental health is, but also understanding their roles in it and where they can help and where they might potentially inadvertently harm. And I think that relationship back and forth, that trust factor back and forth is a really important one. And so I do see that with more training and with more time, we could have a culture shift for the more positive result.
Thank you. I have another question from the audience, and this one is for Iman bin Ahmed. The importance of mental health is basically interwoven with Islam. However, there is always the statement that you have to invest more in your Iman in order to feel better, or that your Iman is weak, etc. But how do we find a healthy balance between these two? And how do we divide our days practically in such a way that reflect that we feel enough from both the spiritual and the mental level? This question was from Umayma.
Thanks, Umayma. I think it would be helpful to see them as one and the same. They come together. And what I mean by that is it's not that if your Iman is weak, you can't have good mental health, or one lifts the other. And in turn, sometimes one brings the other down as well. And so to say that actually, oh, my Iman is weak, I don't deserve, and I hear this a lot. I'm not a good Muslim. This is why I'm getting this. I deserve this. And almost that relationship with faith becomes a punitive one. And that doesn't help. So it doesn't bring your faith up, and also still affects your mental health. So I think the conversation, the shift would be towards, actually, I'm not feeling that great spiritually. And how do I get there? But also, I'm feeling anxious. How do I figure out ways to cope with that? And it could be spiritual strategies, but also it could not be. And I'm not saying that, it's only spiritual solutions that are there or not. But what I'm saying is that figure out what works. And that's usually my motto. Always I say, what works? What makes you feel better? And obviously making sure that it's not something that brings you away from your faith. But if exercising brings you better, again, it makes you feel better, I don't see why that comes in the way of your faith. And so that relationship of, unless I'm on the prayer mat, everything else is not okay, or actually I deserve to feel this way. God doesn't want you to feel bad. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he makes us kind of when we read the Quran, we are connected to him. We should feel closer to him. We should feel like actually the doors of mercy are there for us. And when it becomes a punitive relationship, we become fearful, right? And it causes anxiety. It's quite an oxymoron, isn't it? When we feel like we are being punished for having low faith, therefore our anxiety increases. So I think is figuring out how to merge the two in a way where actually, if I work towards my mental health, if I exercise, if I do something that doesn't go against my faith, that's actually me trying to get better. And also it can help you spiritually as well. If you feel better, then you maybe have the space for mental space to worship better and not be as distracted and as down. Does that make sense? So if it's exercise, if it's painting, if it's drawing, if it's baking, reading, all of these different things, not because they don't have the label of Islamic in that sense. I think I've seen that separation a lot of like what's an Islamic activity and what's not. That can sometimes be a bit confusing. So whatever it is, you can, you're dedicating your body to a good cause, or your mind and all of that, that can really help. And reading, if you feel like you are, you would listen better to a specific imam or a specific qari, and that's okay to have a preference in that sense. That's okay. Maybe that's something that you can connect to while you're painting or while you're drawing, whatever it is that you're interested in.
Dr. Rania, Iman mentioned something really interesting when it comes to the guilt that we sort of create within ourselves to compensate, saying, "Oh, I'm feeling bad because my Iman is weak." Where does that come from in the brain? How does it work?
So if I might rephrase your question, if that's okay, alhamdulillah, I'll say, that I don't know necessarily that it's per se coming from the brain, but the thought, of course, may be generating from there. But certainly that interconnected model that I was referring to earlier, where the heart, the spirit, the soul, these are all connected entities within ourselves. So, and I think Iman did a good job explaining this too, where one might dip, the other might dip as well. And when one goes up, the other goes up as well. And so to understand it better from a sense of interconnectedness is more important, to see why it is the heart is at rest. What is it within the soul itself that's troubling the person as well. Often in therapy, we do a lot of work in kind of digging down to the very roots of the cause, because often people might come in and say, well, I'm feeling sad or I'm feeling anxious because X. And sometimes it's a very surface thing. But as we dig and dig and dig further, deeper down, we realize actually it might be because of Y and Z, right? And maybe a little bit of X too. But there's some deeper things that need to be actually addressed. So this is often why sometimes people have the sense of like, we'll see, because let's give the example of depression. If somebody is very depressed, some of the clinical signs for depression, for example, is that they're unmotivated, that they have a lack of energy, that they're not sleeping well, they're not eating well, that they're not feeling like they are worthy. There's a lot of things that come with depression, and that stagnation of being able to do much. So then that means religiously, they may also be slacking and unable to do their prayers regularly on time, even if they used to be somebody who prayed regularly. And so they look at that and say, aha, I'm not feeling well because I'm not praying. Well, actually, it's a bit of a chicken or egg here, because it's like, because of the depression and your inability to even get out and brush your hair or brush your teeth, then of course you're not able to get up and pray either. It's all very connected. But when we solve it, suddenly we're able to do all of these different things. So it's not just an Iman factor. It may be one of multiple factors that influence a condition, a mental health condition like depression.
So we urge the people that maybe join this live in the middle of it to ask the questions, if you have any, in the comment section of both YouTube, if you're watching on YouTube, and Facebook, and the team will provide them to us, inshallah. A question from Mustafa, specifically aimed for you, Dr. Awaad, is do you think that we are in need of Islamic medicine or psychology degrees for medical professionals today in order for them to be educated and help others better?
Not necessarily. I don't know that they need to be, and thank you, Mustafa, for the question. I don't know that they need to be degrees, full-fledged degrees per se. I do think that the original form, for example, if you look at our great predecessors who did influence the field of what today we would call psychology, ilm al-nafs as we understand it from a Muslim perspective, They come from all different disciplines, right? For all the different Islamic sciences. That's what's very unique about us. We're not, in our sense, it's not, again, with that holistic understanding, it's not just the realm of physicians or the realm of counselors, but rather, the spiritual sciences entered it, and also those of Hadith and Quran, and so many different sciences influence. And when you think about that, there's something in common with all of them. Abu Zayd al-Balkhi was not famous for being a physician. What he was famous for was being a geographer. And that's what he's most famous for. But if you look at the biographies of all the greats, you'll find something common in them, that they all had the foundations of Islamic understanding before they launched into whatever it is they were doing. They all had Quran, they all had a certain amount of Islamic studies before, and it didn't have to be full-fledged degrees in it, before they entered into the field and actually helped whatever field that they were working in. And I think this should be the case whether you're becoming a mathematician or an astronomer, or whether you're becoming a teacher or a counselor. I think we need, as Muslims, we need to have those foundations. Now, for those of us in this kind of hoping, inshallah, to a revival of Islamic psychology, or psychology bringing Islam into it, we have found, for example, if you look at all of our Khalil Center offices, the leadership within the offices are those whom we call dual trained. They have trained in the Islamic sciences fully and trained in the psychiatric or psychological sciences fully. The reason being is because under them, they have a whole group of people that they are now training. And in order to train, they have to have been well versed in both. So if one day you're going to be a teacher, a leader, a trainer, if you will, then yes, I would think you would have to have both together. But otherwise, the fact that you have foundational understanding and then pursue medicine, like your question was asking, I think that would be sufficient, and in fact a great thing for Ummah, inshallah.
Barakallahu feeki, Dr. Rania. We've had a fantastic session so far, so we're going to have the last question, inshallah, for Iman. Spending Ramadan in lockdown can become stressful, especially with not being able to perform your worship in the manner that we are used to, going to the mosque perhaps, and meeting people and having iftars together. What is the best advice to deal with this stress or self-struggle, in your opinion? The question is from Abdurrahman.
I think, well, I touched on it a little bit earlier, trying to maybe stay connected in different ways, and having kind of moved around quite a bit myself, different countries. I've always been kind of far from family, far from friends. I figured a way. I'm not that great at it. Everyone will tell you I'm not that good at staying in touch that much, but it's more kind of trying to figure out what would keep you connected to that person. So like I said, if it's my parents, having a daily chat at the end of the night. We do Tarawih at home. This is my first time doing Tarawih at home. My husband leads, and he suggested it because it's not something that we do. Like I said, we used to go to the mosque and everything, but because I was pouting about like, oh, I was looking forward to Ramadan, I wanted to go to Tarawih. This is a year that I knew how to drive in London and I could go to all the different mosques. I had all these like grand plans. But I think keeping some sort of consistency. Tarawih is short, it's short and sweet. And I think that's something that we can maintain daily. Even the meals, trying to make kind of a different meal each day. Don't cook every day. Sometimes, someone sends me a meal. Sometimes I drop off, a dessert to someone's house, to their doorstep. So those are different ways of staying connected that we didn't have to do before. You used to go to iftar to somebody's house. You might not be able to do that, but you could still share a meal. So I saw that, just today, someone actually donated a meal on my behalf, and I just received an email, and I was like, oh my God, that's so beautiful. And that was a way of me connecting to that person, and I made dua for them, and I was so happy. And it was just an email that I received, and it was a thought on their behalf. So there are so many deeds that we can do that aren't at the mosque. We do, like I said, we can make plans to go to the mosques once they open up, but in the meantime, what are the deeds that we can do, and how are the ways that we can stay connected? So those are just a few examples, whether it's sharing food, worship, or just a thought or a word that can go a long way. So those are different ways of staying sane in lockdown. And when it comes to anxiety, when it comes to the fears and not feeling that great, absolutely try to reach out to a family member, a friend, or even a professional. There's so many helplines I know in London, and I'm sure all over the world, where you can call in specifically about your anxieties about COVID-19, and you can be comforted or have your word. So that's when you're not feeling okay, which is okay. These aren't normal times, and that's okay to not feel okay right now.
Indeed. I feel compelled to ask the same question to Rania, to just hear, Dr. Rania, to just hear your take on this, how we can spend the Ramadan in lockdown or in quarantine or in during, you know, these restrictive times.
Iman did such a lovely job, mashallah. I think that there's really little to add to it. I might add one additional thing that I've really been thinking about quite a bit lately, which is you think about the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as to why we're in this state, not just individuals, but as a humanity, all of us, and specifically how it entered into Ramadan and changed so much for all of us. There isn't anyone who isn't affected by this, even if you weren't directly ill, subhanAllah. So, one of the things that I've been thinking about, this has been an involuntary lockdown for many people, an involuntary seclusion. But could there be a wisdom, a silver lining in all of this, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to learn how to be with Him, in a seclusion, if you will, spiritually. And Ramadan, as we know, the sunnah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was to do i'tikaf, right, to actually go into a spiritual seclusion. Granted that this for most people had been within the masjid. The women here are quite lucky because they're able to do the i'tikaf within their homes and keep up the sunnah of the Prophet, in this case without any of the men, unfortunately, this year. But the woman can keep it up, mashallah, and the men and women can both do an equivalent of that without the formal intention of i'tikaf, which is khalwa, or spiritual seclusion. And you're already secluded, so why not make the best of it and actually go into a moment where you actually spend a little more time on that prayer rug and actually do some of the concepts that we use in therapy, which are, meditative, contemplative techniques. And again, without having to go to secular meditation, which is a very common prescription that everybody seems to be giving these days, mashallah, is to go to meditation or yoga. But we ourselves within our tradition have our own aspects of this meditative contemplation in terms of the tafakkur or tadabbur, which is the pondering of the Quran. Tafakkur is contemplation, or tadakkur, which is doing dhikr, a remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I find that when you contemplate on these aspects, the very things that you might hear a therapist say, journal, write about, talk about, think about why such things are happening within your life that calm anxiety down. You can channel all of this even from an Islamic perspective. Better yet, that you do it actually in a situation where you're able to get the thawab or the reward, than just sort of secular meditation, if you will. So I think that this is something I would add to it because I find it very powerful. And I'll share one last thing, which is that, my own teachers have said how much they have always wanted their students to grow spiritually, but often we're such busybodies. We're running around and commuting and traveling and work and school and kids and a million things, and never sitting down to really connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the modern Muslim often says they don't feel connected. And the one group of people that I'm finding that are celebrating, not COVID in any way, because it's been, subhanAllah, a big test and tribulation, but celebrating the seclusion, which is the spiritual teachers. They have been saying, Alhamdulillah, finally you all are able to sit yourselves down and connect spiritually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And one teacher would say often that the concept of i'tikaf or khalwa is a necessity, kind of like the pressure cooker. For those who've tried to cook with a pressure cooker, all the life stresses and difficulties build and build and build and build, just like steam builds within a pressure cooker. And if you don't have a safety valve to let the steam out, that pressure cooker explodes, right? And same with us, that the valve, the safety valve for us is actually that concept of seclusion, i'tikaf, of connecting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that lets the steam out, lets that anxiety out. And if you don't have it, you do feel like you're going to explode. So I really recommend in this lockdown, Ramadan that we're all experiencing, is to take the time, especially because it's the sunnah of our Prophet, especially in the month of Ramadan, but also all year long, to do this, inshallah. And I think it could give a relief to all, inshallah.
It's been a wonderful session to host, or rather be a student of, should I say, taking part of the knowledge that you have shared with us, and we take this with us and implement it in our everyday life. If you have last thing that you want, if you could just summarize everything and just give us one thing each that you want us to take with us to our homes, to our communities, what would that be? We can start with Iman, inshallah.
All right, I wanted to think about it. Okay, I'd say be a source of light for someone. And what I mean by that is when you feel like you're okay and you're on top of your game, there's usually someone that isn't. And you know, with, like I said, all the labels that we have, anxiety, depression, what have you, mental health, all of that, a lot of the time it's a quick check-in, it's a conversation, it's a good deed that puts a smile on someone's face. And I know it sounds so simple and simplistic, but we have that power, direct access to that power. We're talking about kind of knowledge and all of that, which is amazing and great, but sometimes we might feel like, oh, I don't have all of that, what do I do now? And know that you have the power to uplift someone, to make someone feel good. And like I said, you could listen to them, you can do something that they like. And a lot of the time in when it comes to support, and most of my work as a counselor being in the community, it is giving that ear to someone and saying, oh, how's it going, what's going on, or that regular check-in that I have weekly with someone and say, oh, how have things been. A lot of the time it's the power of that relationship, and not taking that for granted, because sometimes you say, actually, I don't have that much to give, but actually your relationship and your connection with someone, could be a friend, a family member, goes a really long way. You could be that, you could be the person that's keeping that person going, or keeping them positive and going through these times. So be that person. And if you are going through a tough time, then think about who that person is in your life. And it's okay to ask them and say, can you be there for me? Inshallah.
Good for you, Dr. Rania.
Sure, inshallah. I think to add to that, inshallah, the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will never burden a soul more than it can bear. So the one thing I think I really want to share with everybody, and hope that we hold on to this as much as possible, because even though these times are tough, to remember that Allah has made us tougher. And even though he has sent this very difficult tribulation our way, he does have the power to take it away, and inshallah will. And whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has brought us to, inshallah, he'll bring us through it. And I think that hopefully those concepts can hold true for people as they're reflecting, contemplating, making dua. We really are in need of dua, mashallah, as not as a ummah, but as a humanity, mashallah. But I think these spiritual aphorisms, if you will, are definitely helped me get through this, and I hope they'll help others as well, inshallah.
Barakallahu feekum. Thank you very much, Dr. Rania Awaad, joining us all the way from the West Coast of the United States of America. Thank you so much, Iman bin Ahmed, joining us from the United Kingdom. You've been a source of great inspiration for us, and a source of great knowledge that we can implement in our everyday life. This Ramadan, you can support FEMYSO's work, representing and defending Muslim rights at the highest levels and developing hundreds of youth across Europe every year. We're joining a match funding competition at LaunchGood platform for organizations with the highest number of donors, aiming and targeting days 10 and 13 of Ramadan. So keep an eye on our pages to contribute. And don't forget that FEMYSO has launched the Ramadan Auction 2020. You have a chance to take those items that you don't really use anymore, those beautiful items, maybe it's a painting, maybe it's a signed book, and send it to a local coordinator in your country. And that product will go on to an auction at the end of the month with none other than, I'm not going to say the name, it's a secret guest so far. So take a look at our pages, inshallah, if you have an item that you want to donate. We had two very interesting final words from Iman and Dr. Rania, and that was to be a source of light, and that we live in hard times, but Allah has made us tougher. Thank you very much, Dr. Rania. Thank you very much, Iman. I hope that we will see you in other settings, inshallah. It has been a joy and an enlightening moment. Barakallahu feekum.
Thank you for having me.
It's been my pleasure.